the third finger on that passage, and let the phrase breathe on the last note of the bar. She demonstrates with a quietness that has a practical authority. There is no exaltation and no pity in the motion, only an insistence that the body can be instructed in new ways. Trying the fingering she suggests feels like reading a new sentence. The phrase moves with a slightly altered contour, and for a moment so brief it could be dismissed as illusion, I sense a kind of return. Not to the chromatic rainbow that once accompanied each pitch, but to an internal logic, a shape whose edges I can now perceive without color. I tell myself, as one might recite a consolation, that this is not recovery but adaptation. Sophia watches my face closely. "You look surprised," she says. "Yes, I admit. I look like that only when I find something I had misplaced. Then don't lose it. The tone is not jocular. It is almost cabalistic in the way teachers sometimes are with students, an encouragement masked as command. I am grateful in a way that is almost ashamed. Grateful because an exchange of technique has yielded anything at all. Ashamed because even this small salvage feels like a concession. After she leaves, I sit with a small dossier of internal arguments. If technique can be reconfigured, if the fingers can be taught a new idiom of movement, and the ear trained to attend to structural cues rather than chromatic prompts, then perhaps there is a path that runs parallel to the one lost. But it remains a path without the old map. I am reminded of the anecdote Herbaum once told me about a carpenter, a man who, in the absence of a spirit level, learned to hold a plane so that a table did not wobble. The carpenter did not mourn the missing instrument. He learned to inhabit a compromise. I want to be that carpenter, but the thought of it feels too practical, almost petty, in the face of a public that expects miracles. And yet the ledger tightens. Marta's voice, when it arrives on my phone, is brisk. She has lined up a small, low-stakes rehearsal, she says, nothing to alarm the press. It is not a comeback, she insists, though I know that is a matter of phrasing for her more than conviction. It's a measured step. We must show that you are working. I agree because it feels dishonest not to. There is that old professional reflex to accept any stage that will be held for you, even as a prop. I go to the rehearsal because supplying a surface of activity is, in some sense, necessary. The rehearsal is a lesson in how the social apparatus of music assumes the presence of the inner life that once made performance true. The hall is small, practical, light from a bank of frosted windows. Marta paces, checking a clipboard. There is a tone of optimistic skepticism about her. She wants to make something of this moment, and is honest enough to admit that business instincts are sometimes indistinguishable from care. The rehearsal begins, and I find that under the pressure of observation my deficits are more tangible. I make an error that is not spectacular but is irrefutable, a staccato that spills into legato, because my internal emphasis is misaligned. A technician coughs in the back. The error is small, its significance is large. I leave the rehearsal not with a plan but with the texture of failure clinging to me like dust. It would be melodramatic to say this moment defined me, and yet all art is composed of moments pressed into narrative. The event collapses into a ledger note, rehearsal error reconsideration. I could call it a setback and be done, but the humiliation is a different thing. It is private and social at once. A knowledge that one has been seen to be less than one was supposed to be. The body remembers the applause of 1,000 evenings. It also remembers the way a single cough can feel like judgment. It is when the season of small failures accumulates that Herbaum's letter arrives. He writes in his old, slanted hand on a sheet of paper the size his own life suggests, compact, well-ruled. The letter is not sentimental. He does not ask after my feelings. He commands a regimen. There is no moral virtue in waiting for inspiration, he writes. There is only work. The reed is still a reed whether or not the river swells. Attend to the reed. Reading his sentences aloud to myself, a habit that is less about theatrics than about feeling the logic of instruction inside my mouth, I find the cadence of his thinking stabilizing. He tells me to practice scales as if they were prayers, to relearn bowing on the piano's phrasing as if it were a manual of craft. The letter is heavy with a faith in method that is almost religious in its certainty. I feel both chastened and oddly comforted. The world is not a place of miracles, he seems to say. It is a place of habits you must keep even when the gods do not listen. I begin, in the days that follow, to administer myself a new kind of discipline, not the heroic stretching for an impossible return, but the careful accretion of small, measurable gains. I time how long I can hold a pianissimo without losing focus. I practice scales in rhythmical variations until my hands stop asking for color cues and begin to accept structural ones. I take the advice of my younger students and the old cadences of my teacher and stitch them together into a regimen that feels less like recovery and more like construction. This is the strange work of the chapter, to find the dignity of craft where once there had been the intoxication of gift. There are days when it is unbearably dull, the way a photograph of a fire is dull for lacking heat. There are other days, smaller and quieter, when a fingering discovery a new, unpretentious way to make a low bass sing feels like a small triumph. I collect these small triumphs like coins and place them in a drawer labeled possible. They will not pay the bills of recognition, but they will pay for a modest internal currency. The knowledge that I can make something coherent without the help of the colors I once took for granted. The chapter does not close with a revelation. The piano is still an honest instrument that returns what is given, and the world is still impatient. But the humiliation of those first days has been tempered by a practical decision. I will not seek miracles as Marta would advertise them. I will not chase publicity as a salve. I will, instead, attempt the slow and quiet work of rebuilding a craft, of teaching where teaching can be useful, and of learning a new grammar of sound that does not insist on chromatic light. There is, in this decision, a faint relief. It is better to build scaffolding than to pretend the ruin is not there at all. On the last page of my practice journal for the week, I write a single sentence, in the sort of ink one uses when making a promise. If music is a house, I will learn new rooms. The sentence feels both humble and defiant. Outside, a tram bell rings indifferent and punctual. Inside, the lamp hums. I close the score and look at my hands, which are patient and unexpectedly steady. They no longer carry the certainty of color, but they will carry, perhaps, a more dependable sort of knowledge. I put on my coat with the plan to go out, partly because the flat has become an archive and archives tend to fossilize what is inside them. The market district is a dangerous idea. It holds both the practicalities of life and the improbable possibility of an encounter that could open a different doorway. I have not decided to search for miracles. I only tell myself that it is time to leave the rooms I have made for myself and to see what else the city might show. Perhaps that is prudent modesty, perhaps it is a prelude to foolishness. Either way, I step out into the light, and the world, which does not owe me color, continues indifferent. At the corner I hesitate for the fraction of a breath, and then walk toward the tram, thinking of carpenters, letters, and the small sacrament of scales. The evening air contains the smell of bread and diesel and something like possibility. I do not know what the market will hold, only that, to keep practicing in the solitary economy of the flat will not be enough. If I am to make music that matters to me and not merely to others, I will have to teach, to be taught, and to accept the slow arithmetic of small progress. It is a different promise than the old one, but it is a promise nonetheless. I cross the street and the bell of a shop door rings, ordinary and bright. The scene is unremarkable, and for this reason it feels exactly like the beginning of something that might hold. I had meant only to buy tangerines. It was a small errand. A ritual required more by the need to move than by appetite, and one I kept to myself as if a modest domestic task might be less conspicuous than the larger, more public mistakes that had concentrated on my name. The market I chose was off the tram lines I had once navigated with unconscious assurance. It belonged to a part of the city I visited rarely, for reasons I could have named. The stalls smelled of more coal than linen, the pavements were more puckered, the complaints of the world more immediate and less dressed for review. I went because it offered what my flat did not, a place where I could be anonymous in a way I had not been allowed to be for decades. I had convinced myself that anonymity would be a salve, that the mechanical exchange of money for fruit would be a small, unremarkable contact with life that required no narrative. The market unfolded in the ordinary way markets do, a cluster of tables, a cavalcade of colors rendered by their own realities, rusting metal crates, the bright, clinical sheen of apples, a pile of onions that seemed to gather light into themselves. A man shouted prices in a register that had little to do with arithmetic and everything to do with ritual. A woman with a stout scarf tied tight around her jaw threaded a discussion about the weather with the same tenor as she packed sausage into paper. The world presented itself in layers of texture and purpose. It was astonishing, in its way, how little of that I could now say was mine. I had not planned to look at the side alleys. They were for small domestic tragedies, lost mittens, a child crying because a coin had rolled away. I hesitated outside one stall where a man, perhaps a little younger than me, perhaps a little older. The market is a place where age negotiates itself differently arranged cabbages with deliberations so precise it might have been training. Beside his table a figure sat on a low stool, a canvas board across her knees. I saw her at once because the shock was not so much the sight of paint as the fact that in the market, among its grocery pragmatisms, there was someone making an image for no apparent purpose other than the compulsion itself. She was small, wiry, a dark braid thrown over one shoulder, knees freckled and bare where the paint had not reached. Her hands were as stained as the aprons that surrounded her, but theirs was a different kind of stain, not the grace of frying oil, but the concentrated, intimate smudge of pigment. She had a tin of brushes, a dented palette, a rag, and a dozen tubes of color squeezed in a disorderly row. She painted, her head slightly cocked, with an attention that had nothing theatrical about it. There was no attempt to attract, no operatic demonstration. She appeared to be precisely absorbed. It was the economy of her gestures that held me. She did not search the space, each stroke was a decision. A flat brush lay down a wide, deep area of blue. Then, with a smaller brush and a rapid wrist, she applied a thin, almost surgical line of red that did not so much cut as suggest a quick, sharp accent. The painting, even in its infancy, possessed a grammar I recognized not because it imitated any photograph but because it obeyed a logic of tension and release I had once found in sound. Where I had expected to be unmoved, my chest registered a response that was more physical than intellectual, a partial remembering. "Good morning," the market vendor said without looking up. "Careful with that paint, Leanie." She only grunted, which was a grown-up equivalent of an apology, and went on. I stood a few paces away as if I had been rooted there by a gust. It occurred to me, with a characteristic combination of embarrassment and curiosity, that I had looked at paintings before and not been moved by the color per correspondence of my old life. That used to be the distinguishing feature of my perception. A chord could be blue, a phrase could be apricot, and this synesthetic map had been intimate and reliable and private. Now the map had been erased. I could tell the difference between ultramarine and cobalt, between carmine and vermilion, as any ordinary person might, but the direct, involuntary binding of sound to hue the private compass that made music a topography I could walk had gone. In this girl's movements there was something of that compass, or perhaps an echo of it. I have always been cautious with children, perhaps because I have the temperament of a man who has been watched much and judged more reserved, formal, thinking carefully before speech. It surprised even me when I found myself stepping closer. There was a foolish, fumbled willingness in my approach that I did not usually afford myself. Perhaps what drew me was not the paint, but the recognition of the pattern, long, substantive washes followed by brief interrupts, like a chest inhaling and a sudden cough. "Excuse me," I said, forcing my voice to neutral. Do you come here often?" The question was inelegant. I could hear how it sounded. It was, nevertheless, the only one I had. She looked up. She was not so much surprised as mildly inconvenienced. "Not really," she said. only when there's enough light to see what I did wrong yesterday." There was a candor in the reply that disarmed me. She returned to her brush and made a red dash, quick and decisive. "Who taught you?" I asked. The question came because questions are how one gathers detail. I was collecting evidence to see whether this was coincidence or a pattern. "Nobody," she said. "My mum paints signs. I learned watching." The simplicity of the answer was not the point. It was the fact that she had a logic that did not seem to need words. "What are you painting now?" She hesitated, the single pause of a child weighing whether to make something polite of the truth. "A sound," she said, in a voice that was small and almost apologetic for the audacity. It was the word sound that did something in me. I had no right to expect miracles, and yet the sentence was a key. I stared at the patch of blue she had laid down and felt a memory that was not visual but structural. A feeling of weight that in other circumstances I would have identified as belonging to a low E. But of course I could not hear it as such. There was no auditory stimulation from her brush. The contour was emotional, a particular density of blue that sat heavy on the board. It had the gravity of a note you feel before you explain it. Do colors mean things to you?" I asked carefully. It felt as if I were stepping into private property. "Sometimes," she said. She did not elaborate, which was typical. She had the economy of an observer who had already learned the world was not very interested in listening to children's philosophies. Then, surprising me, she reached out and pushed the board toward me as if testing me. "Try," she said. "Tell me what it says." I took the cardboard in my hands. The board was warm where her fingers had rested. The blue was not painted with finesse. There were visible overlaps where the brush had gone back and forth. The red line, by contrast, was single and sure. I found myself creating sentences in my head, the way one does when trying to translate an unfamiliar language, long, low phrase, then a quick accent. The translation was not precise in the way that a trained ear would demand. It was impressionistic, but it was enough to make something stir. "What would you call that blue?" I asked, perhaps foolishly seeking names. She named it as a child names things, directly, without theatricality. "Lake blue." "Not the bright one, the deep one. Like when the tram goes under the bridge, and you can't see the sky." I felt the image and, perversely, wanted to correct it into musical terms, to say low E or bass or something technical that would translate her intuition into my former vocabulary. I did not. I let the metaphor stand. "Are you selling these?" I asked, a practical thought intruding. It was the kind of question managers ask when they see opportunity. It was not flattering, but it was realistic. The market, after all, is where transactions take place. "No," she said immediately. "They for me. Sometimes I trade. But mostly for me." She said it as if the premise that an object might simply exist for the pleasure of the hand was a reasonable one. And I found myself smiling at the way she pronounced the word trade, not like a negotiation but like a small, everyday barter. I hesitated, then made an offer that made me sound ridiculous even as I made it. Would you paint something like this again? A small one. I would pay." She blinked. "You'll buy my rubbish." "You're not rubbish," I said, which was unnecessary and yet honest. "I would like to see more." She considered, eyes narrowing in concentration that made her look older for a second. "How much?" I named a sum, modest but real. Her face registered no discernible shock. She seemed to have a working knowledge of transactions I did not imagine for a child her age. "Tomorrow," she said, "by the bread stall. Noon, 50 cents. It was a bargain. She had lowered the price and with it, set the terms so that I could not mistake her for a charity case. She gathered her brushes and, with a quick, precise motion, wrapped the board in a scrap of newspaper and handed it to me. "Keep it," she said, and then added as if by afterthought, "but don't tell my mum I sold it." I walked home with the parcel tucked under my arm like contraband. The market sounds returned in a wash, the low argument of a vendor, the cawing of pigeons near a statue, a child's shriek of pure pleasure, and yet my mind kept returning to the small board. I had the ridiculous, private sensation of someone who had been given a map piece. It was not that the painting would restore the vanished color-music bond. It was that the painting provided a different affordance, a tangible object against which I could try measures without the performative pressure of an audience. At home I made tea because the movement steadied me. I set the board beside the kettle and looked at it with the half-clinical curiosity of a man cataloging a specimen. I lay a hand on the blue. It was dry and slightly grainy. The red line caught the light like a small scar. When I closed my eyes, there was no inner noise. There was only the recollection of the way the blue had sat in the market air, like a held breath. There is a kind of shame that lodges in small things. Mine had lived in large public humiliations and in the private geography of sleepless nights, but it also inhabited small quotidian moments, the way I put the kettle on, the exact angle at which I left the music stand in the flat. This painting, improbable and slight, touched that private geography and made it uneasy in a new way. It suggested paths that had not been available when the map of my inner perception was whole. It suggested that other people had internal logics, and some of those logics might be, if not homologous, then commensurable with mine. I did not sleep well that night. I found myself arranging a schedule, absurd in its detail, that included a return to the market, a negotiation about space for Leanie to paint at my flat if she wished. A thought that I might almost as a practical exercise teach her certain things about structure. The idea felt both ridiculous and necessary. Ridiculous because I am a man of 40-odd years suggesting to a child how to order her play. Necessary because I was desperately seeking scaffolding for the unpeopled place inside me. In the quiet hours I permitted myself a private catalogue of objections. Children were unpredictable. A child's palate might be idiosyncratic, and what seemed like correspondence to me might be pure coincidence. Anja, if this child were indeed bound to an adult, might be protective or wary, and I was not a man with much cultural capital in negotiations that did not involve a keyboard. I had, too, the professional reluctance of an artist to put myself under the tutelage of chance. My career had been built on rigorous hours and careful standards of excellence. To place trust in a market child's instinct felt like a betrayal of the discipline I had cultivated. Yet I recognized the truth behind such scruples. They were to a large degree a refinement of pride. The alternative to begin, as I had not for a long time, with small experiments that might fail was frightening. I had once been a man who valued certainty in order to produce beauty. Now there was no certainty, only the small evidence of a painting wrapped in newspaper, and the knowledge that I had promised a sum of money for a repeat performance. The next day I walked to the market at a time I had not been to a market in years. Noon, when the light was horizontal and forgiving. She was there as she had promised, low stool occupying the same small niche. Her board lay on her knees like an instrument. The vendor called to her as if she were part of the market's furniture. When she saw me, she did not make an event of it. She made the sign of an agreement and returned to her work. We agreed, without much ceremony, on the terms, a canvas, 2 or 3 small sketches, and my offering of a lesson once a week, not to school her in the way conservatory teachers school, but to show her simple structural elements, phrases, cadence, the idea of tension and release. She listened to this proposal with the concentration of someone who was not used to being consulted about her life. Finally, after a short while, she nodded. It is absurd, perhaps, that I expected some immediate, transcendent return. That was never how recovery, if recovery is the right word, begins. Instead there were small, modest signs, the way her palate shifted when I mentioned the word phrase, as if the vocabulary itself supplied a subtle gram of gravity to her choices. The way she began to outline with charcoal before committing to color, a practice that suggested an instinct for planning, even when the execution remained impulsive. When I walked home that second day, the market felt less anonymous. There was a thread now, an appointment in the world that was not my name on a program nor the judgment of reviews. It was simpler, a bargain, a promise, a small sheet of painting that might, in time, become a way of practicing the strange art of listening that had to be relearned not as restoration but as translation. I do not know, and I do not yet know, whether Leanie's colors will keep any fidelity to the sounds I have lost. I only know that for the moment the world is offering me a new vocabulary, and that my hands, so accustomed to the keys, are learning the humility of accepting instruction from a child. There is, in that reversal, a kind of chastened pleasure, a slight, private amusement, and a beginning of something like hope. If the market taught me anything in those weeks, it was that one must look where one might not have thought to look, in alleys, beside cabbage crates, in the small, polite transactions between people who do not expect to be read. The great halls will wait. They are patient. For now there is paint on cardboard, and a child who does not seem to care whether her work will be praised. She paints because she must, and that bare necessity has a truth that no program can manufacture. When I left the market the second day, Leanie called after me in a voice that had a prescriptive directness. "You bring the metronome," she said. I looked back, startled. "Why?" "Because I want to try painting something that goes with it," she said. "Like make the tempo blue, not just the note." The idea was so simply precise that I laughed out loud. The sound startled me because it was an honest noise, not a performance. "All right," I said. "I will bring one." Her grin was small and quick, and then she bent again to her board. The market resumed its music, the stallholders' banter, the click of a coin, the distant bell. The painting in my bag lay like contraband next to the percussion of daily life. I walked home counting my steps the way one measures a bar. And for once the counting was not an anxious habit, but a way of marking my place between what I had lost and the possibility of a new, modest architecture for listening. The thought that troubled me at the end of that day was not that I might reclaim my old faculty that seemed an absurd vanity, but rather that I might learn to translate again, which is to say to accept that music need not be a private map in order to be true. Translation is, in its most humble form, an act of attention. If Lennie's hands could make visible the shapes music used to make for me, then perhaps I could learn to read those shapes in another register. It was not recovery I sought. It was evidence that another way of knowing was possible. I slept better that night, not because the market had fixed anything grand, but because there was a small, concrete plan, a metronome, a stool, a child who could, perhaps, teach me to see the arcs of sound again in a different light. The colors had not returned to me as they had been. They had arrived in a new guise, via a child and a cardboard, and for the first time in months I permitted myself the private sensation that the ledger I kept of losses might, with time and patience, begin to show entries of a different kind, not restitution, but remapping. The idea that my art might become a conversation, rather than a solitary possession, was almost unbearable with its simplicity. And so I wrapped the thought carefully, like the small painting in newspaper, and kept it under my arm as I went about the rest of my day. I had not intended to return to the market that week. It was, as with many small decisions since the accident, one of those acts that look like whim when described and like necessity when executed. A need to be outside the rooms that contained the piano, a way of letting the city decide what he might tolerate of its business. The market on the Sechtelplatz sits across from a bakery that refuses to change its windows to the new lighting. The loaves glare at you with the same honest crust regardless of whatever the papers choose to say. I found the stall by the smell linseed oil and turpentine, the scent that had been for years the less visible companion of my life in varnish and varnish smell. The child was there, as if she knew the stall belonged to the narrow quarter between the fruit seller and the tobacconist. She painted on cardboard, not canvas. She had a small box of mixed pigments, cheap, bright, unreliable, and a brush that looked too large for her grip. The strokes were quick and final. There is a certain economy to children's painting that always unsettles me. Decisions are made with a single line, without the apology of revision. I watched, feeling the odd relief that I could still recognize the cadence of a hand at work, even when my own interior signals had been silenced. She was making a square of very clear blue, not mixed into anything else, and the blue took the cardboard the way a small sea takes a hollow. For reasons I could not have rationally explained then, perhaps because of history or perhaps because I was simply living badly with absence.